Hey everybody, welcome to Pop Culture Philosophers. It's time for Comics Revisited. Today we're talking about Sandman Book 2, The Doll's House. That's right everybody, thanks for checking out the video. I am Rockin Robbie Billups. This is
Brian Weaver.
And today we're going to be talking about Sandman, The Doll's House, which is Book 2. Earlier this year we talked about Sandman Book 1, me and Brooks did on Comics Revisited. Now me and Brian are revisiting The Doll's House. This was actually the very first collected edition of the Sandman. In fact, when they first did it, they didn't put out the first 7 issues. They had 8 through 16. Now Doll's House is 9 through 16. It had that epilogue from Preludes and Nocturnes in it. But this book is where a lot of people feel that it actually starts becoming the Sandman that most people know and love. What do you think, Brian, about the book overall and just its place?
Well, I'll say rereading it this time, I really enjoyed it more than previous. I always kind of glossed over this one when I would reread Sandman. I've only reread it probably 3 or 4 times because it takes a while. I mean, it's 75 issues. Yeah, and it's not fast. A lot of areas are not fast. But, you know, kind of having a pretty good grasp of the overall story, too, it is kind of interesting to see how much, actually gets set up in this.
Yes.
That goes on through the 75-issue run with that special.
Yeah.
You know? And the art is really solid in it. The pacing of it is really good, and it's got one of my favorite single issues, probably just period.
The Hob one?
Yeah, that Hobgaddling one.
Oh, yeah.
Because it does actually, it seems like a throwaway, I think by design, in a way, but it explores a pretty cool topic that lots of people talk about and, you know, think about and do these things. But it also, there's actually a couple of story elements that come back to really haunt Morpheus.
Yeah.
You know, towards the end.
Oh, okay.
And everything like that.
Yeah.
So.
You know, Book 1 of the Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes, really leaned into the horror aspect. And that's something me and Brooks talked about on that video, was that it was less of a fantasy book and more of a horror book. I would say that Book 2, and here's my copy right here, Brian, this hardcover edition that I have. I love this one. They make like a rainbow when you put them all together. Yeah. They're all different colors and whatnot. There are many different ways to get the Sandman. I'll throw some links down below if you want to check it out. Some great Omnibus Absolute editions, nice hardcovers, things like that. I don't even think mine is the recolored one. I know that they've recolored it lately. But anyway, that book, the first one, delves into horror and leans into it pretty heavily. This one is still kind of leaning a little bit into it, but it's definitely now more onto the fantastical side. More of a dark fantasy, less of just a straightforward horror story, right? Mm-hmm. This is where the book really does start hitting its stride. I don't think Doll's House is the best arc in the Sandman, but it really does start building up on what has already been established. We get introduced to more members of the Endless, Desire and Despair. We get introduced to the idea of destiny and delirium. We don't meet them, but we get introduced to the idea of them, the fact that they're a family, they're the Endless. I think this is the book where they first are called the Endless, and I think it's Nada who says it at first. I think it's in that.
I didn't pick up on that.
I think it is. Maybe I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that, but I think so. It also, like you said, has great artwork. So we got Mike Dringenberg returning in with Malcolm Jones III. Mm-hmm. But you also have, for instance, the comic book debut of Chris Bachalo.
His debut.
It's his debut. His very first published work was a Sandman comic, right? And it's great. You also have Michael Zulli in there and a bunch of other great talented creators, the lettering, everything about this book. It's just an expertly crafted book. The Doll's House was really an interesting story. It's a bunch of different stories. Like you said, the Hob story is kind of placed in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. The Nada story's in there. You got all this other stuff about the Jack Kirby, Joe Simon Sandman in there. So kind of it does almost mirror Preludes and Nocturnes in that the biggest gist of this is that Dream has taken a census. And there are 4 of his creations that are missing. So just like in Book 1, he had to go and find his missing relics. Now he has to go find his missing creations from the dream. Which, of course, are Fiddler's Green and the Corinthian, who we'll be talking a lot about. Yeah. Brute and Glob, of course, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing starts with a story. It's basically Nada's story. Nada's the woman that we met in hell that Dream passed in book 1. And we knew that there was something there, and there was, for some reason, Dream wasn't forgiving her and she was in hell. Well, you kind of almost get a version of that story. And that's one of the things that's really cool, is it's a version of the story. They even in that make it a big, big point. It almost seems disconnected, like the Hop story does, from the main gist of Dream trying to hunt down the Corinthian and the others, right? And then the idea of Rose, and we'll get to that in just a second. But even just visually, it's tied in because of the glass heart, right? And what is Desire's sigil? Is like the heart, right? Yeah. And then at the very end, with the vortex they pull the vortex out, what is it? Yeah. It's like a glass crystal heart or something like that. So we'll get into some of those rich themes. Is really cool stuff. So after the Nada story, Dream Morpheus is trying to hunt down these missing creations, right? Then we're introduced to Rose and her mother Miranda. And Miranda and Rose, Miranda's mom is Unity Kincaid, who we saw pretty much slept throughout most of the 20th century. At some point, she was raped and had a child. The child was then kind of given away. That was Miranda. Now Rose is her descendant. So they got a nice connection there to the original first book. Then there's also Rose's brother, Jed. She has to go eventually and hunt him down in Florida, right? It's down in Florida, I think.
I think he ends up there because of the vortex aspect. Yeah. Because I think he was in Georgia.
Okay, they were in Georgia, but they wind up down somewhere in there in the South. All these different characters, it all comes together to a big head. Rose is staying at this house, and so you get a look at all these different people's lives, like Ken and Barbie, for instance, and Barbie becomes a big deal. Yeah. You know, these characters, they may seem like just throwaway one-shot little stories or whatever, but a lot of this does come back, like you were saying, to be a big deal, right? Then you got the Hob story thrown in the middle there. He hunts down Brute and Glob. They've taken up residence in Jed's head. They're like twisting it and all that stuff. The Corinthian, oh my goodness, and the serial convention, but it's actually a serial killer convention. That was one of the things that really stuck with me early on when I was first reading Sandman, like 20-something years ago, was that issue. And how disturbing it was because of how matter-of-fact things were to them. You know, like the way they were talking is very creepy. But then, of course, you find out Rose is actually a vortex, which is some kind of entity that comes about once in a generation, and it breaks down the walls of the dreaming, so everybody is no longer in their own private dreams, but it's all one shared space, and it just gets chaotic, and it's something bad you don't want to happen.
Yeah, it sounded like it could be like the end of humanity in a way, because like people would just basically go insane. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to process your life and you know, because that's part of what dreams do, right? Is, you know, they kind of help you process things and get rid of stuff, you know. Yeah. And so that's it was insinuating that. Yeah. So it was actually pretty dire. So I'm sure you mentioned this a lot, but this is definitely a spoiler thing, because like you don't want to know all this stuff without reading, you know, and then
Comics Revisited, you know,
because this is like the way this stuff unfolds is part of the magic of this story.
It actually is, absolutely. You know, one of Rose's roommates turns out to be the fourth missing creation of Dream, Fiddler's Green, which is actually a place in the dreaming, and he's actually a very charming and endearing character. Yeah. And you fall in love with him. At first, you're a little suspicious of him, but then you really kind of get in there. So you find out that Rose is the vortex, and actually it should have been Unity, but Dream was imprisoned, and Unity was sleeping, so it didn't happen. It passed down through Miranda into Rose, and basically what happens is Unity, near death already, pulls the vortex and takes it on herself again, because Dream has to kill the vortex. Turns out the person who raped and impregnated Unity was Desire. One of the siblings of Dream. So Desire is a he, she, they. Desire is a really interesting character throughout this whole book. And there you got this sibling rivalry going on. You find out Desire is actually responsible for the Nada thing in a way. They're responsible for the vortex. And it's all a ploy to get Morpheus to kill one of his own blood, which is apparently another thing you cannot do.
Yeah. That's I mean, that touches on a couple things, but like, you know, when you're talking about like, you know, the first book is kind of him getting his symbols of power. Mm-hmm. I guess they have power, but I mean, you know, we look at those things as really just kind of the symbols of power: the helmet, the sand in the bag, you know, and all that stuff. But this is like, and he had to do that first to be able to do all this other stuff. But you know, this is him cleaning up his kingdom and stuff like that. But I look at like this one too is one of the, to me, the beautiful things about Sandman is the way Neil Gaiman structured the things is like it just unfolds.
Yeah.
Like, so there's it, it like, maybe it seemed like it at the time, but it just like, it seemed to me when I was reading it this time, it was like, it was just, this was taking some pretty good jumps in establishing this mythology of that he was setting up, the endless, their qualities. And I guess one thing I like about that desire thing, like trying to do these things is like, a lot of, mythologies always have like a trickster god. Or it's almost like the younger ones, they're actually split into older and younger ones in the endless. It's like all the younger ones are technically tricksters.
Yeah.
They all have that kind of trickster
They
element.
got something to prove almost in a way. It's a little Loki-like, another trickster archetype in mythology, right?
Yeah, and those are always cool, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times those tend to be the most fun parts of a lot of these stories.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about Neil Gaiman's Sandman is the personification of these elements of humanity, right? And I love this moment towards the end when Dream finds out Desire's behind everything, and he tells them basically like, we do not control the humans actually control us. Mm-hmm. And if there was one kind of like threaded theme throughout this whole thing, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff and we'll be getting to that, but like Desire themselves, the way that Neil Gaiman paints this character. First of all, twins with despair. Mm-hmm. So Desire and Despair are like linked in a way that none of the other two really are. Right? Mm-hmm. So what is that saying, first of all? Right? That's saying something really intentional there. And then also the idea that Desire's palace is basically a big statue of themselves, and they live in its heart. Mm-hmm. And it's called the Threshold, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
And just some really interesting things there. You briefly meet Despair, and you get the idea that Despair will always follow Desire's lead. And I think that's another thing that is very meaningful. Because Despair's, you get the idea, and you find out later on that Desire's the one that really kind of manipulates a lot of this stuff, and Delirium and Despair kind of get swayed by that. And I think it all starts from a focal point of Desire. If you think Jeff Johns did some amazing things with the emotional spectrum in Green Lantern, it ain't nothing compared to what Neil Gaiman does with the Endless. I love that.
Yeah,
and in the middle of all this stuff, you got Hobbs' story. Now, it's one of my favorite issues of Sandman. I know it's one of your favorite issues. Why don't you just talk about it real quick, explain it, and just why you like it so much.
Yeah. Okay, so basically it starts off, Dream and Death are in a bar in England somewhere.
The 1400s or something?
Yeah,
right?
1400, sounds right. Yeah. Having a conversation, and they start hearing this guy very loudly boast about how the only reason people die is because they want to. Like they could, like if they just made the choice not to, they wouldn't have to. Mm-hmm. And so Dream and Death basically let it happen. They want to see what happens. It's an experiment in a way, just to see. And so this guy ends up doing it. And then that night, when it happens, Morpheus comes up to his name's Hob Gadling, right? First,
Hob something.
I know he changes his name over time, but Morpheus sits down next to him and says, meet me in this bar in 100 years. If what you're saying is true, like you don't have to die, and just because you don't want to, meet me back here in 100 years. And sure enough, like they meet up, and so like the thing is, the comic is a series of them meeting every 100 years, and in the first 100 years he's fine. It's like good, right? He does all these cool things, and changes his name. I can't remember if it's the next one or the one after that. But he comes and he's got a wife. She's pregnant. He's like on top of the world and all this stuff. And then the next time, he's just like stone cold broke. Barely made it into the place. He's almost like he weighed
out.
like 50 pounds.
Yeah.
Right. He was completely emaciated and completely just depressed and everything. And then it like I think the next time he comes back and he's all good again and everything like that. But he's like part of the slave trade.
Yeah.
And Dream says, that's really not good, right? You should look at doing something else, and then, and it goes to 1900s, right? Is the last one.
The last one is,
it does.
Yeah. The last one is current day.
Yeah. So, I mean, and he does come back, later on in one, I think during the wake,
it's
or the
because
kindly ones.
The one right before the modern day one, he basically insinuates that Dream keeps meeting him because Dream wants a friend.
Oh, yeah.
And Dream gets really pissed about that.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't even know if he's going to show up in 1989, 1990, whenever it is.
Right.
But he does, and he admits that he's his friend.
Yeah.
And that's a really touching thing. And it may seem oddly placed, but this book starts off with the story of Nada, who, and the way that whole thing is told, it's told they're this an elder from like a tribe somewhere in Africa, and it's like a rite of passage that they're doing to become a man. They go out there, they get circumcised, they got to find something. He finds that heart, that glass heart, and he has to tell them the story. And we only get told the story once. You only get told the story once, and then one day you're going to be me, and you're going to have to tell it to another young man who's approaching manhood, and all that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And then they even mention it, like the interesting idea that if it was told by a woman, it would be different. It'd be a different story, right? And there's some really cool stuff there. But Nada's story is she's from one of the first cities on Earth. It's amazing. Think of it like Wakanda almost in a way, right? Yeah. Maybe not so futuristic and modern, but still like a beautiful, amazing, a magnificent ancient civilization. She falls in love with Dream, right? But that can't really happen because it's not for us to fall in love with the Endless, she says. And I think that may be the first time that we know they're called the Endless, whatever. Anyway, Dream gets wrapped up in it. She leaves him, and then eventually she kills herself to get away from him, right? Because he won't. And this reveals the pettiness of Dream, right? Yeah. And he really starts this book out, and he does not paint the protagonist in a good light whatsoever. No. Yeah. And Dream has been very cold already in this book. Like in book one, he's kind of a very cold figure, right? So that moment with Hob really breaks it down. Mm-hmm. And it sets the page for, even though he wouldn't have done it if he didn't have the loophole, it sets the scene for his mercy towards Rose at the end a little bit. And the humanizing of Dream that takes place from this point forward in all of the Sandman. It's kind of like the start of that. And that Hob story to me kind of really just centers that. This is a lonely dude. Yeah. He just wants someone to talk to once every 100 years. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, he collects interesting people as part of his staff, too. Yeah. Though, right? So, I guess that's kind of, him trying to, get in touch with some humanity.
Yeah.
And, not be, because he is, even around his family, he doesn't seem to, he follows his role, is what it seems like.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem to, I think Death he seems to have a good relationship with. And then, and he seems to, pity Delirium over time.
Yes. They're like the little sister, the baby.
Yeah. Because her story is pretty tragic.
Yes.
That it is pretty rough.
And we'll get there.
But, one thing I was thinking, when you're talking about the storytelling thing in there, in that Hob issue, the second time they meet up, it's not it's the guy that wrote the Canterbury Tales. That guy's clearly Chaucer. Yeah, is clearly in the bar, spouting off stuff. Yeah. And then the next time, the next 100 years, it's Shakespeare and his contemporary.
I can't remember who it was.
Anyway, which does set up some major story arcs later. Yes. Not major story points and events there. But, it's weaving more of that storytelling in.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I don't know. There is a lot of that.
I said this when we covered book one, but Sandman to me is a story about story. More so. And this is the first of 3 appearances by William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare actually kind of, I wouldn't say he's an incredibly important figure in Sandman, but he's at very crucial moments. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And Gaiman obviously has a major respect, not just for story, but for storytelling. Yeah. And that's something that's thread throughout this whole thing. There's Neil Gaiman packs so much into every little bit. He's aided by the art. It all works, and thematically it's so nuanced, rich, filled with depth and meaning. So everything we're about to talk about is just probably the tiniest little fraction of the entire thing, right? The cruel nature of desire. We touched on this a little bit. I love the idea of what the personalities of the Endless themselves individually say about what Gaiman's trying to say about that trait in humanity. Mm-hmm. Desire is cruel. It's intrinsically connected to despair, right?
Yeah.
And desire leads to despair almost. Like
It does.
This despair will follow desire's lead. It's our desire for things that cause despair. That's like Buddhist philosophy, right?
Yeah,
I mean, pretty
is.
much,
That's
right?
kind of the cause of suffering.
Yeah, right?
The
vanity of despair. But then that's balanced with as evil, but evil's the wrong word, right? Because to Gaiman, it's storytelling over moralizing. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't care necessarily about telling some kind of like, morale at the end of the story. Right? He doesn't care about why he does care about why characters do what they do, but he's not trying to like, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the best way.
No, the end doesn't. It's not like the end of the story. All the bad people get punished, and all the good people are rewarded. I mean, there is that,
and there's the shades.
There definitely is that. But
desire is.
But innocent people still suffer.
Yeah. Oh yes. Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
In this very book, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So, but some really cool ideas there about desire, and then so it's not always so black and white. So desire could be like, that's a villain, right? It's the villain of this piece in particular. But look at how dreams handled. Look at the pettiness, the cruelty, the truly human nature of dream and desire. They're all still humans, and like Dream says at the end, we don't control them. They actually control us. They start taking on these traits.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really beautiful and cool. You were mentioning something about immortality and impermanence. I want you to elaborate on that.
Well, that was kind of the Hob issue.
Okay.
How
up and down it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How we, it's the, people like, some people, like, I wish I could live forever, and all this stuff. But it's like, do you really? Because like you're watching Hob, like, do these things, and you've probably seen this in other stories before with immortal characters where they fall in love with a mortal and, they die and then they're, inconsolable,
Yeah.
And they don't, so eventually they get to where they don't do it. They get lonely because they're afraid of any attachments, not just a romantic relationship. Any attachment will end.
Yeah.
So like you're having to experience that impermanence over and over again, which is a cause of suffering in the Buddhist tradition as well.
Yeah.
If you don't recognize that impermanence is what is reality, basically. And then like one of the things I thought when I was reading that issue is like, I mean, if you were a part of the slave trade, even if you stop, how can you ever reconcile that?
Yeah.
I don't see that being possible considering the horrors of like, cause he was in the shipping part.
Yes.
Which, I mean, owning slaves is terrible.
And he was
the shipping part, like, I mean,
the way he talked about it so matter-of-factly too. You know what I'm saying? Like Hob has a very interesting journey because he starts off and he's kind of just a soldier. He's merc, and that's what he does for his first 100 years. And he starts getting into business, the printing press and all that stuff. Yeah. He gets married, he has kids, they all die. That's when he hits his really rough times and he just gives up basically. Yeah. Then he starts getting back into it again. That's when he's getting invested into the slave trade. And like you said, they're the ones going there, grabbing them there. Like, and the way he just talks about it, like, it's some commodity. It's like, oh, we take them there, we drop them off, we come back with all this stuff, and it's great. It's a fantastic thing. And then he's very regretful of that.
Yes.
Towards the end.
Yeah.
And it's a really cool moment. It's not a moment though where it's not like he earns forgiveness for it.
No.
But just like, we were talking about Gaiman cares more about the story and not so much about moralizing it. Like he doesn't get at this point like we don't know if anything bad really happened to him out of it. He just over time learned, like the rest of the world did, I guess, that this is not a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's something that still happens across the world today. So don't think that it's exploitation and slavery is something that still exists.
The guy that wrote Amazing Grace was in the slave trade too.
Let's see. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Right. This book is also about family and illusions. Right. So first of all, the family connection to Endless.
Yeah. So
you got that. You got Rose and her mother. And Unity, and I love that it's connected to Unity. I love that wasn't just a throwaway thing, that it blossomed into something better and richer in the next volume.
Yeah, I mean that's throughout the Sandman. Like anything you're reading, if it seems like a throwaway, there might be, but it seems like almost everything comes back in some form.
Even Hector's wife. becomes a big deal later on in the Sandman.
Yeah, that whole thing, it's massive.
We were talking about Ken and Barbie, that character Barbie, just one of the roommates in the doll's house, basically.
Yeah. See, I was thinking the doll's house was actually a family, too.
Mm-hmm.
They seemed kind of like somewhat family-like. They seemed pretty familiar with each other, and in certain ways.
Yeah,
it was like kind of like
I can't remember the dude's name.
The landlord,
yeah,
was kind of like almost a matriarch of it.
Yes,
knew what everybody was doing and cared about everybody.
Yeah,
and like did what he could to take care of things. And so I don't know.
And for a book of its time, it was actually, it may not be completely perfect by today's standards, but it was pretty ahead of its time in representation of other types of people, dealing with identity issues and stuff like that, and people of different sexual orientations, and having them in the story as just because they are there, because it's life, Yeah. So that's something that was also very important to me about the Sandman, especially for its time.
And that spider couple,
when
they found each other,
creepy.
I thought that was, it was creepy, but in a way, like, those two people, were alone.
Yeah.
And they were able to, find whatever they needed in each other.
Yeah.
And I thought that was incredibly cool.
Yeah. And then the idea of illusions. So we had Jed, and we already know about his thing and the illusion of Sandman and his wife and their little fake life and all that kind of stuff, because Hector's actually been dead for a long time. I know you're a big fan of that Jack Kirby, Joe Simon stuff. And also the illusions of even the serial killers, right? And I know you thought that we were just going to skip over it, but we got to talk about the Corinthian. The Corinthian is one of Dream's nightmares that has escaped. And to me, out of everything, is one of the most memorable characters in the Sandman, to me, is the Corinthian. His eyes are like mouths with sharp teeth. And he wears his shades. He's a serial killer. He's been on the earth for like 40-something years. There's a serial convention. It's actually serial killers. And even the illusions they have of what they do and why they do what they do.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the obvious illusion of, it's a serial convention. Ha, 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 but that's what this book is really dealing about. Rose has illusions about life and family. Dream has illusions about life and family, This is spread throughout the whole thing. The Corinthian is absolutely an amazing bit. I love that. It's a creepy thing, man. It's a creepy thing.
He's, easily one of the creepiest characters I've ever experienced in anything. I think it's super cool.
Yeah.
And everything like that. And I was super excited when that 6th issue, when he brought it back and the story took place, that he was a part
Overture?
of it. Yeah. I was like, it's so good. Especially to see J.H. Williams draw him. Oh man, it's so cool. But another thing I thought illusion-wise, as far as that serial killer thing, is that, remember the one that wasn't one? It was just pretending to be.
Yes. It was like a reporter or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought maybe he was just obsessed.
Maybe, yeah.
Just like one of the fans, right? Because serial killers have fans.
Yeah, you're right.
And, which should be an illusion. But anyway.
Yeah. A delusion.
Yeah. But yeah, and the way he ended up was pretty rough. But I mean, it was like they were like catching on to him, and all that stuff. And it was just like, I thought that was, pretty interesting take.
Yeah.
And it was like there's nothing really left. Yeah, I mean, let me rephrase that. There was a lot of thought put into this.
Oh,
everything had all these different things weaving in, and I don't know. Yeah. It's great.
When I read it, it does feel very convenient that Jed, who is the lost brother that Rose is looking for, winds up being picked up by the Corinthian. Right? That they wind up in the same place, and she winds up living with Fiddler's Green. And that the other two missing dreams are in Jed's mind. And it's all kind of very connected. But you pointed this out to me. It's because Rose is the vortex.
Yeah.
And it's pulling everything in.
Yeah, because that's what Dream made a comment when he was I don't know if he was explaining the vortex, but no, it wasn't. He realized there was a vortex.
Mm-hmm.
And he was having trouble finding the I don't know what you call it, figments?
Yeah, sure.
And he was like, well, maybe this will help us solve our problem. They'll be attracted to the vortex. And so, she was actually pulling all that to her, which, like I said, like I was saying, this was a really cool section where they're really expanding the mythology of this world.
Yes.
And honestly, it all makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And that's pretty cool.
So to me, Sandman is a story about stories, and not just stories, but storytellers. And Neil Gaiman has such an immense respect for storytellers, especially being a great storyteller himself. In that opening issue, I was talking to you about how the art is lined up, where the storytellers are always at the bottom telling the story, and the story is above them. So the story is obviously bigger than them, but they're still very important, and they ground the story, right? And who knows if this story that we got here is even the real truth, because it's just a story, right? You got that moment when Shakespeare's talking, or it's after that, but Hobbes says something like, I saw King Lear, the idiots gave it a happy ending. Dream says, don't worry, all the good stories revert to their original forms, right? There's so many people in this book that are being reverent to story, and then others that are being irreverent to story, and come to horrible to ends even of stories and stuff like that. For instance, you can almost imagine like everything Dream creates is a story, right? The Corinthian is a nightmare he created. That's a story. That's a story that was being misused. You know what I'm saying? And then the idea of what was it, Brute and Glob, like what they did to story, you know? And it's just, there's a lot in there that you can really start picking up about the reverence that Neil Gaiman has to storytelling.
Yeah. I mean, but that's kind of what life is. And that's the way our minds work, is we always kind of have this running narrative. I mean, we're creating our own story as we're living.
Yes.
And it's heavily based on perception. So, I mean, it's like when you're saying that we're not even sure if that's the right story. I mean, that's it almost by definition can't be.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's being told by somebody. So there's
your perception, your perspective. Yeah.
Is what you're going to get out of that.
Yeah.
And it depends on the receiver. And I think that's part of it too, is like you actually have the storyteller and the receiver in there too, right? Which is, very critical aspects of how story goes.
It's like that telephone game we used to play back in elementary school.
That's a better version.
Yeah, right. Something like that. Absolutely. This revisit was so much fun for me.
Yeah.
I've been enjoying going through the Sandman, and I'm actually enjoying the way we're doing it. We're doing basically 2 volumes each season. So every 20, like basically 1 episode every 10 that we do, right? So therefore, we're not sitting here and just trying to just plow through Sandman, because I don't think that's necessarily the best way to read it. You definitely, they can all, you could read each Sandman book on its own with no connection to the others. And maybe towards the end, especially in the wake, you'll kind of be like, huh? Yeah. But they do work as their own, and I like how it all flows together in one narrative, though. But it's a book that I really like taking the time to read in a volume chunk like this. I don't really like plowing through it. There's so much to it that you can miss easily. Yeah. And instead of doing a video about all of Sandman, I really like doing these things where we're talking about just because look at how much there is to talk about in this one already. You got multiple stories all going on, all overlapping, coming together, telling thematically relevant stories and stuff like that. And I just absolutely love it. This has been such a joy to revisit. What'd you think about the book on the revisit and your final thoughts on it and its legacy?
Let's see. Legacy. I mean, probably its biggest legacy is, well, just on storytelling in general. But it also, I mean, it does set up so much of the other stories, and in itself, it's a really good story. Like it does end cleanly and make in a way that makes sense, and that like at least Rose survives, and her mom does, and they actually have it, and Jed does, which thank God he did, right?
He had a really
so terrible,
really rough time in this book,
and they're able to I think they come back in certain ways, right? I mean,
Rose does,
Rose does, yeah,
for
and
sure.
So it sets up a lot of those, and like maybe it's not a legacy thing, I don't know, but like just the concept of Fiddler's Green, I think shows kind of some of Neil Gaiman's magic, because he's not a person, he's a place, but he came to Earth to be a person. He wanted to know what that was like, and he was like one of the nicest, most kind-hearted, what people think they want to be, right? And things like that. And so that's I just thought that was amazing.
Don't you also just like feel so sad when he goes back? But he goes back because well, you're here and I got to go. Yeah. And this was fun while it lasted. But man, I just love that character so much.
So cool. And I know it's not exactly the question you were asking me, but I did want to point out that the physical appearance of Desire is based on that artist Richard Nagel from the 80s, known for Excess and the Duran Duran covers, in Playboy.
That makes sense.
That real sharp, angular, really defined, look and everything like that. I just remember because I remember when I was first reading that, I was like, oh man, that's that dude,
Yeah.
And I think he died very young, in the late 80s and stuff like that. But that was to me that was a perfect selection because that guy kind of is associated with the excess of the 80s.
Yeah.
Where desires just run rampant, right? There's no, it's untethered, and
we're being sold it all the time, and one of the first things you see of Desire in the Threshold is you see them in the monitor screens or whatever, and it almost looks like an 80s music video.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like a Eurythmics video or something. And I read one article where they were talking about how Desire reminds them of was it Annie Lennox
from Eurythmics? Yeah.
And definitely you get that.
I can see that.
Because androgyny was a big thing in the 80s too.
Yes.
And I love the character Desire, and I love the fact that Desire is a he, she, it, they, and I really, really like that. And I think that really says a lot about the nature of Desire. And that it's not a masculine thing, it's not a feminine thing, it's a human thing.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love it. You also get the idea in this book that Dream appears to different people differently based on their expectation and their perspective, which is how we all view a story. It's based on our own filter. It's on our own perception and culture. And that's what I think he's meaning when in that Not a Story in the very beginning, he says, the women tell the story different, but of course that's just the way it has to be. I don't think that's a jab at any gender. I think it's a point about perspective and on giving and receiving a story, right? And that's something we can all know. And don't be hating too much on people just because they like different things than you because they're approaching it from a different perspective, right? I don't know. I think there's a lot we can learn from Sandman. And it's just such a rich book. We talked about it before. We talked about it in this video. We'll talk about it again. This is one of the absolute best comic books out there. Neil Gaiman, he's a legend now. But he wasn't so much a legend back then, but this is where that comes from.
I remember seeing him at the 90s. I was at the 98 Heroes Con. And, it was Rockstar.
Yeah.
Straight up Rockstar. Just walking around the street, entourage, everything. Man.
Yeah.
I was
now he's got TV shows and all that kind of stuff.
But deservedly so. I don't know if we brought this up before, but just throughout the whole Sandman art, one of the best things about it is that, in my opinion, is the emotional spectrum that is covered throughout this whole story. It hits pretty much every emotional thing, and nothing really it's not jump scares or anything out of place or any tricks. It's actual genuine, character progression, certain events, in different times, and it's like you were saying earlier about it's not a morality tale. It's much. I wouldn't break it down to a series of events, but it is it's just kind of laid out there for you.
It's got a lot of connective tissue. It's a very imaginative and very innovative story. The artwork, everything about it just works in perfect conjunction. The best lettering in comic books, especially for its day, in my opinion. I love it. Love it so much.
Well, it had to be. There was a lot.
Has to be.
There's a lot of dialogue.
There's a lot of dialogue. It's verbose, but don't let that throw you away. It's very literary and very cool. So, thank you so much for checking out the video. Let us know your thoughts and recollections when you revisit Sandman Book 2 down in the comments below. And join us next week for another all-new episode of Comics Revisited Season 2. We're nearing the end of Season 2. And we're gearing up for Season 3. Anyway, I've been Rockin' Robbie Billups. This has been
Brian Weaver.
And we've been talking about the Sandman here on Comics Revisited. Please do like, share, and subscribe. And join us over at popculturephilosophers.com for podcasts and a whole lot more. Thanks for rocking with us. Kramer.